because, number one, Jeremiah is a guy who definitely, at any point in time, we could ask that question and it fits with Jeremiah. But number two, that's kind of the mantra that he's picking up with. Remember, we're writing a section that is really the only consistently positive and uplifting section in the entire book. We're in the 31st chapter, and man, has it been really, really great. It's talking about the Messianic kingdom. It's talking about the church and how the days are coming. Over and over again, he repeats that. Behold, the days are coming. And that's a phrase that signals, hey, the days of Jesus, the days of the church, the days that you and I are living in, the days when we've been waiting for good things to take place. Well, now they're finally here. So he's been cluing us ahead, saying, hey, look at these good things that are going to happen. And now he's going to jump into a section where he talks about this idea of guilt, this idea of getting what you deserve versus getting what you didn't really deserve, but somebody else did it and caused the problem for you. So a good cross-reference here would be Ezekiel. And we'll get to that. Well, no, I guess we won't get to that. But Ezekiel chapter 18, that whole chapter is kind of the main passage on this topic. And so that's a really good parallel. So, starting off with this picture here to help guide our thoughts. Jeremiah chapter 31, starting in the 27th verse we're picking up, he's going to quote a proverb. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord. Which, again, signals what? Behold, the days are coming means it's going to happen, and specifically, what time period are we looking forward to? Whenever he says this phrase, pretty much every time, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, it is a prophecy about Jesus and the church, a messianic prophecy. It's a prophecy that we need to pay attention to because it most likely is going to apply very directly to us. So remember, every time we see that phrase, behold, the days are coming, that clues us in. Oh, that's a clue. This is talking about Jesus, Christ's kingdom. Generally speaking, that's a good clue. When I will sow the house of Israel and the house of Judah with the seed of man and with the seed of beast, as I have watched over them to pluck up, to break down, to overthrow, to destroy, and to bring disaster, so I will watch over them to build up and to plant, declares the Lord. So he's saying with the same intensity, the same purpose that I was watching before, not the same purpose, but the same intensity that I was watching, looking to punish guilt, to deal with the problems and fix it, now I'm going to look and focus just as hard on giving you good things, of helping you, of giving you blessings. And then he continues from that positive thought. It's said in verse 29, in those days they will not say again, the fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. But everyone will die for his own iniquity, and each man who eats the sour grapes, his teeth will be set on edge. Interesting proverb, right? The fathers eat sour grapes, the children's teeth are set on edge. Ezekiel 18 will spell out that proverb in much greater detail, but you can already kind of figure out from this context, even in verse 29, verse 30, you can figure out the gist of that proverb, right? What does it mean to say the fathers eat sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge? What does that mean?
The children reap the consequences.
Yes. The fathers are doing the action, but the sons, the kids, are suffering the consequences of their action. They're suffering as though they did it when they didn't do it, right? That was what they were stating, what they were saying in this particular proverb. That was what it meant. And so Ezekiel in the 18th chapter is a great reference for this because he spells out how this all works, and he's saying, hey, no more doing away with this proverb. Forget that proverb. Why? Because people are held accountable for their own sin. And in Ezekiel, he said, in case you don't understand, let me give you some hypothetical situations. And he actually pictures, a person with a son, and then that son has another person, and one's good, one's not good. Well, are they going to suffer only because of what they did, not because of their good or their bad father, and so on and so forth? I forget which order it puts it in, but he spells it out in great detail. So Jeremiah is just referring to the same thing here. So the question kind of becomes, why would a proverb like this no longer be used? And I think it's important for us to ask, because it kind of begs the question, why did it come up in the first place? Why is it in at least 2 Old Testament books are they talking about the use of this proverb? Is that really the way God is? Is God the kind of God who punishes innocent people for what their parents did?
He did.
What are you thinking
In the
of?
Old Testament.
In the Old Testament, what specifically are you thinking of? Because I do want to be very careful with this. Is God the kind of God that, punishes someone who's innocent because they had a bad parent or whatever? We a little gun shy today, guys. Yeah.
Is that a Bible verse that the sins of the father will pass on to their sons? I know
Hey.
it's a past something.
I think you guys are onto Exodus 20, I believe, is what God talks about when he's laying out the 10 Commandments. I believe it's right in that passage there where he said, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the children of the fathers to the children, to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to, 1,000 generations of those who love me, a whole bunch more. Yeah, that's a good passage. I didn't put it in my notes, but I was thinking about that, and maybe we should talk about that briefly to help spell this out a bit. So are we implying that God was that kind of God in the Old Testament, but then we get to the New Covenant age and he becomes a different kind of God, a God that's, oh, I don't do that anymore. You guys are going to quit saying that because I only punish those who deserve it now. And that's why I needed Ezekiel and Jeremiah to prep you guys, to get you a heads up and say, nope, I'm not going to do that anymore. Or is there something else going on here?
He's saying it later on when Jesus comes.
Sure.
He'll change the covenant.
We've got a bit of what you might say a dilemma, because he set it up by saying, behold, the days are coming. So he hinted at Messianic age. And then he says, this proverb, they're not going to talk about it anymore. It's not going to happen because everyone will die for his own iniquity. Each man who eats sour grapes, his own teeth will be set on edge. Let me see what Bibles we got down here. All right, we have an ESV. All right, well, since you brought it up, let's go ahead and go to Exodus 20 real quick if you guys want. We'll jump into that because that's probably important. That is the main passage that I am aware of that people would go to when you think, oh, God punishes others for something that they didn't specifically do. Where is it where it says he's laying out the 10 Commandments there?
20 verse 5, 6.
Oh, thank you. You shall not bow down to them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So, the numbers there I do think are significant. And the words used there I think are significant too. And this is something that I left myself a note, sorry. Pay attention to this note. I'm not going to be here next week, so you don't have to be either unless you guys want to fellowship without me, that's fine. But yeah, no Monday night class next week. Everything else is golden as far as I know. So in the 20th chapter of Exodus, he's saying, he's making this statement about fathers, but what it says there, if you were to look at it very literally, and the ESV I think is a very good translation here, he says, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation. It uses the word for visit, which is a very generic, very open word. A lot of times it just says, your time's coming, something's just going to be there, it's going to show up. Using that generic phrase I think is good, and it's helpful to us because it's not necessarily saying that therefore this is a guilty party, that I am holding you guilty because of what your dad or your grandfather did. It doesn't say that. It says the iniquity of whatever dad or granddad did will be visited onto the children to the third and fourth generation. Well, who's the third and fourth generation? Right? Well, the son would be the second generation, right? Grandson would be the third generation. So sometimes even the fourth generation would be a great-grandson. What are we talking about? A typical lifespan here, right? Generally speaking, a lot of people live to see their grandchildren and sometimes their great-grandchildren, but it's not often we go for much. There are some exceptions.
Now we do.
What's that?
Now we do. Back
It's
in the old
getting
days,
crazy.
people lived 120 years,
Some of them, yeah.
or
But
110 years, or 100 years.
sure. So, and that's not a bad way to look at it. So even about 100 years or so, the third, the fourth generation, if you're in a lucky enough area where there's not war or a disease to come in and wipe you out, yeah. So what is God saying? I think he's making the point, if your grandfather or your father does something and there's a terrible consequence, does that consequence affect his kids?
Yeah.
And does that consequence sometimes even affect his grandkids and even possibly his great-grandkids?
Yeah, the situation that he put himself in is gonna, they'll have that same type of situation maybe that will happen to them.
Yeah.
They'll be in the situation that could happen.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, how about with Moses? He made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years.
Yeah, because they were faithless and refused to
Right.
go in. Sure, yeah. And that whole generation died out, and then he gave the chance to a new generation. That's true. The point that I think is significant is, number one, he says visit. Number two, third and fourth generation. I don't think God is saying that therefore, 3 and 4, you're guilty. 5, you're gold. You got to pass. Whew, barely got off that one. I'm so glad it was my great-great-grandfather that goofed up and not my great-grandfather. I'd be in trouble. He's not saying that. He's giving the idea of a length of time, a rough estimate, the third and fourth generation. And I think all he's getting at is that when one person messes up, a punishment comes, and that punishment affects their entire family, everyone around them. They may not be guilty, they may not have wanted it to happen, but they are still going to suffer as the result of this decision. For instance, if God ever, the times when God cursed the land, the times when God said, Elijah prayed and God said, all right, I'm not going to let it rain. Did that only affect the sinful people at that time? Or did it also affect the kids? Right? It affected everyone alive right then. And that's true of what sin does. It affects everyone who's alive at this time. Everyone around us are affected by it. So I think that's an important distinction to make. God is the kind of God that when he punishes, he will punish, and it will have powerful effects, not just to you, it will affect your family and those around you. And I really think that's what Exodus is getting at there. So I definitely have no problem with that. Ezekiel 18 is our other reference. So, now we can go back to Jeremiah. What's going to change? What's the distinction being made? The fathers eat sour grapes, the children's teeth are set on edge. Is there something different under the new covenant as far as guilt is concerned than there was under the old covenant? This is, admittedly, I take some time to think about this because this is not like a, oh yeah, it's simple kind of a thing. And just so you guys know, scholars, a lot of scholars are really, they have a hard time with this one. Yeah.
Well, I would add to that, I appreciate what you said about the lifetime and also visiting, but I would add the difference between consequences versus guilt.
Yeah.
Because you reap what you sow is a principle both Old Testament and New Testament. It's in Galatians chapter 6 as well as here in the Old Testament. But the Jews in Jesus' day tried to play this card as far as Abraham's their father. So if he's right with God, we're right with God. And John said, hey, God can make these rocks into descendants. So you may get favor because you're Abraham's descendant. You get some of the blessing, but that doesn't mean you're saved. So consequence versus guilt and righteousness, I think another big distinction.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for emphasizing it because, guilt is a big difference than just consequences, Drunk driver, kill somebody, it doesn't mean that they were guilty of something. Or what did Jesus say when that tower fell and 18 men died? You know, were they really evil people? No, you know. So yeah, not a guilt thing. So if we are talking about guilt here, and I think that's a very important distinction to make, is there some sort of guilt differentiation? And some of what some scholars think that in the New Testament church, that they try to make a distinction between the people of God in the Old Testament and the New. And they say, you know, the New Testament church is a little bit more individualistic. And what he's getting at is that sin might be more localized, but it will never really permeate throughout the entire church like it did in the days of the Jews, when sin would really permeate throughout the entire nation and they would all suffer as a result. It would be more localized or whatever. So that's one theory that is thrown out there, but I'm not a big fan of that one, honestly. I think that's kind of stretching a bit. One that I want to bring up, and then you guys can shoot me down if you think this is a little off base or whatever, but it comes from Romans. Romans chapter 5, actually. It comes kind of from what you were saying too. Because if we were to start off this discussion with the New Testament in mind and think about what does the New Testament tell us about the Old Testament, one of the distinctions I used to think when I looked at Romans and stuff, I kind of read some verses that made sense to me and I ignored some other verses that really didn't make a lot of sense. And I just assumed, hey, if you're an infant or if you're someone who's just born, you're good. You're perfect. There's nothing wrong with you. There is no original sin. That's just purely Catholic, and all Catholic things are evil, and that's it, right? I'm just kidding. But I used to just dismiss it that way. But then you start reading Romans more carefully, and I hate to say it, but when you read it carefully, you realize it does not sound nice and simple like I just laid it out. Like, oh yeah, there's no such thing as sin until you hit a certain age of accountability, and it doesn't say it that easily and that precisely. It does start talking about in Adam, as in Adam all die, and it does start talking about this concept of original sin. And you really can be scratching your head for a minute and you think, well, wait a second. Original sin, so we're all guilty for something that somebody else did? And it sure sounds, I mean, not that I want to believe that, but it sure sounds like that's what it's implying. Especially when you look at Romans chapter 5. Because of what Adam did, we are now suffering consequences, but also the guilt. Some sort of guilt seems to have been passed down as well. It just seems that way from Romans. But you keep reading and you don't stop. Because when you keep reading Romans chapter 5, you learn that there isn't just this original sin. What else is there? Grace. And we could even call it, some have called it original grace. When Jesus died on the cross, when he offered himself as that sacrifice, he introduced the potential for something that that's the reason why Romans would call him the second Adam, the greater Adam. Whatever stuff, whatever original sin we ever got from Adam alone, whatever stuff that we are born into and that we are guilty of at birth, Jesus is so much greater than Adam. And his grace, his original grace, is going to wipe that out. So now you're responsible for your own sins. And you need to choose to get right with Christ. You know, you need to choose that. But anything that you inherited, Jesus took care of it. So I think more accurately, that's going to be the view I take when you look at Romans. The idea of, yeah, there is some sort of original sin, but there's original grace, thanks to what Jesus did. And that takes care of it. So no, infants are not needing to be baptized. No, they are, the mentally deficient or whatever, they're not needing to be saved in the traditional sense because they don't have the mental capacity for it. They can't choose to commit sin in any sense of what the word sin is, going against what they know about God and stuff. So it's only the original sin, and that's not a problem because Jesus took care of it. So, sorry, big digression, but come back to where we are today. Under the old covenant, if Jesus had never died, right? A number of things. If Jesus had never died under the old covenant, could people be saved? Under the old covenant, sacrificing all the lambs and everything, could they be saved if Jesus never died at the cross?
No.
Absolutely not. The whole old covenant would not work. Nothing works. What'd you say?
It was just rolling it ahead till he came.
Yes, they were just pushing it off into their conscience the whole time. Hebrews is like, man, this bothers me. I just killed another thing. I don't feel any better. And it's just pushing it on until Jesus comes and he completes it all. And we realize, oh, it's only because of Jesus that the old covenant people could be saved, just like the new covenant people. It's only by faith you're saved. And it's because of Jesus' sacrifice, which is retroactive, right? So, if what Romans says about original sin is really a problem that came from Adam and it's introduced, and Christ never died on the cross, hypothetically, Jesus just never showed up and never died on the cross, what would take care of that? Would we be guilty of that too, if that is in fact an issue? From what I can tell, we would be. But because of Jesus and what he did under the new covenant, he introduced what we might say his sacrifice, the second Adam, original grace. He more than nullifies it. So that is no longer an issue at all. I hope I'm making some sense. It's not easy to explain this necessarily either. But because of what Jesus did, that whole issue is wiped aside. So, because of Jesus, everyone does die for his own iniquity. Do you see what I'm saying? Because of what Jesus did, there is no, oh, well, Adam really did it. I was just born in sin because of what Adam did, and you're going to punish me for that guilt. Nuh-uh. No. Jesus took care of that. That's gone. You are going to be punished because of what you chose to do, not because of what Adam chose to do. I feel like if I talk more about it, I'm only going to make it worse, but I'm getting inquisitive looks, so maybe we can talk after. I hope that makes some sense. I just wanted to suggest the idea that there is this little concept introduced in Scripture of a certain amount of guilt that is not something that we necessarily did. Adam started it, and it infected the world. But because of Jesus, that was taken care of. So maybe before Jesus, if they were holding on to this idea of we'll just blame Adam for it, they could quote a proverb like this and say, oh yeah, Adam ate the fruit and here I am suffering. I'm gonna be punished for it. No, God's making it clear, no. You're not going to be able to say that anymore. Well, why? Why am I not going to be able to say it anymore? Jesus knocked out what Adam did. Jesus wiped it out. You got no excuse. It's all on you now. So under the new covenant, you could clearly make that statement. You couldn't clearly make that if you didn't have Jesus otherwise. You wouldn't understand why you couldn't blame things on Adam before. So, all right, I better stop talking about that. I'm just going to make it worse. But hopefully, I think you guys already understand this. There's a reason why we, here we don't baptize infants. Number one, it's dangerous. Number two, they don't need it. They don't need it. It's not. It is not something that they need, because this is for someone who is actually wanting to accept Christ for their own responsibility themselves. It's their own relationship with him, not because of somebody else's wrongdoing in the past. So that's the main thing. Okay, 31, verse 31, one of the more famous verses in Jeremiah. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. But this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it. And I will be their God. They shall be my people. They will not teach again each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more. That's a powerful passage, isn't it? It really is. So, the new covenant is not like the old covenant. That's the reason why you call it a new covenant, right? It's different. It's updated. And that's why the author of Hebrews kind of spells this out. When you make a new one, it's to suggest that the old one is obsolete. It's going away. It's gone. That's why you make a new one. I know this sounds so basic, right? I'm only saying this because there are common views out there today of people trying to suggest that the new covenant is just the exact same thing as the old covenant, and the old covenant's never really gone away. That's a very, very common view these days, and they love scriptures like this to talk about why we need to keep the Old Testament law, and why these covenants are still, mutually in effect in different ways. But that's not what Hebrews says, and if you read carefully, that's not what this says either. A new covenant. And it's not like the old one. It's different. It's not a carbon copy. It's not a replica. It's not everything's, it's a whole new age. It's going to be great. Now do the exact same stuff that you did that caused you to fail before. Let's repeat all that again. No, it's not like that. And in that old covenant, they broke it. They didn't keep it. And so he had to drag them out of the land and wander, in which somebody, I think it was our music guy, Mike, pointed this out to me. He heard it in the sermon before. But it's very fascinating. If what they say is true, and I've heard different estimates, but one of the numbers I've heard is roughly 2 million Jews coming out of Egypt, wandering through the wilderness. I've heard of 1 million. I've heard of as high as 6 million. I don't know how many there were, but that's a lot of people. It's an awful lot of people. And if that many people, roughly 2 million people, died in a 40-year span while walking around the wilderness, you know how often people were dying? When I calculated it, you have about 1 death every 10 minutes. Every 10 minutes of walking around the wilderness, somebody's dying. That just doesn't scream happy thoughts to me. I think it was a constant reminder of, wow, we should have obeyed God. Oh man, we should have obeyed God. Why didn't we obey God? And that's the old covenant. That's kind of what he's talking about. That's the covenant that they broke, and they were reminded as they wandered around until a generation died that they let God down and they broke that covenant. But I'm going to make a new one, and the new one is not like that. It's not one that's going to let you down to where you're going to have to wander around thinking, I blew the new covenant. I blew it again. Why did I do? No, this is different. How is it different? Well, he's going to say it in a number of ways. Verse 33 talks about God's law. His law is not written somewhere else anymore. It says it's written on human hearts. Human hearts. Hebrews chapter 8 and chapter 9 are good references to have, by the way. Hebrews 8 and Hebrews 9 really go into these things about the covenant. So he says that I will write my law on their hearts. In Hebrews 8 and 9, it's going to actually quote this text, and it's going to explain that Jesus is now our high priest before God. And it's going to mention, too, that because he is high priest, we don't need anything less than that. We have the perfect high priest. And the other thing that's kind of stunning, when I was reading, when I was finishing up the New Testament in my Bible plan, I was reading about the New Jerusalem and stuff like that, heaven. You know what's missing from the picture of heaven? It specifically says there's something that's not there. You know what that something is? It says there was no temple. It says in this New Jerusalem, it said there was no temple in this place. I'm like, well, hold on a second. I thought that was the whole point. We're going to rebuild the temple, and Christ is going to reign. It's just going to be amazing. But then in this picture of heaven, it says there is no temple. How could there be no physical temple there? You guys know the answer. How could there be no physical temple there? Where is the temple?
Our hearts.
Yeah, it's with God's people. It's God's presence with us. We are his temple. So that's one of the big, huge differences there. Under this new covenant, under this picture, it just makes perfect sense, right? We're not waiting for a new stone building overseas to be built, and then we're calling that the new covenant. No, the new covenant has set up the very same thing that we're going to expect to see in heaven. No temple, because the temple of God, the temple of God's Spirit is within us now. And so he set that up right from the get-go, that God's Spirit dwells inside of his people, his church. So we don't need a physical building to be rebuilt and call it the new temple. God's law, same thing. It is now written on our hearts. It's not just a bunch of commands that are out there. No, it's something that is supposed to be applied in here in a deeper way. So, verse 34 spells it out a little bit more. It says, no longer will a man teach his neighbor or his brother saying, know the Lord, because they'll all know me. How does that make any sense? How does that work? How can everyone automatically know God under the new covenant? Well, let's talk about the old covenant first. Why would they teach somebody to know God under the old covenant? Let's say we're all Jews here, Jewish families, and we are teaching people to know God. Well, who are we teaching to know God? People that don't know God. So who doesn't know God yet? Yeah, probably the little ones, right? The real young ones. They're growing up, they're still learning. They have no idea. And so we're teaching them, maybe foreigners that come in that want to join us, and so we're teaching them or whatever, right? Those are the people we teach. You're born Jew, and so yeah, you're a part of the covenant people, but you don't really know God yet because you're a baby, and we have to teach you, and we'll teach you that. But under the new covenant, you don't need to teach anymore. Why is that? Because everyone born in the new covenant isn't physically born into it, right? How are they born into it? Spiritual birth. Remember that? Born of water, born of spirit. They are, when you're baptized into Christ, it's that rebirth. You have been born into the kingdom. Well, once someone has been baptized into Christ, do they know who God is? Yes, we've established that before that ever happened. So under the new covenant, we don't have to teach people, hey, you need to know who God is, because everyone who is a Christian is a part of that covenant group of people. They already know. That's another key distinction of this new covenant that we are in. It isn't something that has to be, yeah.
This kind of really hits the whole idea of confirmation, doesn't it?
Yeah, I guess it does.
How can you have confirmation when it says you don't have to have confirmation?
Good point. Very good point, yeah. That's the idea, right? You have to teach someone to, oh yeah, we're going to baptize you young, but then when you get to a certain age, why don't you accept that? Why don't you, prove that you really do know God or whatever? Well, no, you can't be in the covenant if you don't know God. Everyone in this new covenant already knows God. That happened at your baptism. Yeah. Let's see. That word for know, by the way, they will all know me, is a word that more literally could be translated to know from experience. They will all have experienced me, which is another kind of neat thing under the new covenant. It's not just that they've heard intellectually about God, but we have actually got to experience him and how good he is and what he does. Infants are not born into the new covenant like with the old, because it's not about physical birth anymore. It's about spiritual birth. And one thing also that I find interesting too, you remember how there were some people that were really, they didn't get to reap some of the same benefits of the old covenant as well, right? It wasn't like it was an evenly distributed, nice, fair thing. There were certain people that they were told, listen, you're not supposed to go into the major worship assembly. You need to stay out. Who were those people?
The priests were the only way out.
What's that?
The priests were the only ones allowed.
Well, in the temple area, yeah, but there were other situations where, you're right, you had to be a Jew specifically, but not even that. If you had certain physical deformities, they would say, sorry, you're not supposed to be in here. Samaritans, yeah, that as well. And obviously people with leprosy and stuff, they had to stay out as well. It was not like oh, I'm born a Jew, my path is set, everything's great. No, it wasn't that simple.
So many rules, though. If you were unclean, if you touched a dead body, there was a million rules.
You're right, they had a million rules. But even notwithstanding those million rules, there were some things that if you were born with this, I'm sorry, you don't get the same benefits that other people do. I mean, ultimately, yes, you get forgiveness. That's the big one. But as far as entering the assembly and stuff like that, it was not all is fair, everything worked out nicely kind of situation. And that's yet another reason why I personally think that's one of the things that God did on purpose. Not because he was trying to dehumanize anyone or try to insult anyone, but he's getting us ready for the real covenant. Just like every time they killed an animal and it was supposed to forgive their sins, but they felt bad, they just murdered an animal, and their consciences were bothered, God did that on purpose so that they would think there's something more. This is not right, and we're longing for something to make this right. And then when they saw Jesus, they'd realize, oh, it's finally right. It finally works. This finally makes sense. He wanted them to look forward to that. So the same thing here. All these times when you're like, wait, he didn't mean to get born with a deformity. Why is it he can't go in and worship with the rest of us? It's just the way it is. That just doesn't seem right. That just doesn't seem... And then God sends his prophets along and said, hey, guess what? All those things that you thought didn't seem right or whatever, behold, the days are coming. Make it all right. Everything you've been longing for, everything that you've been bothered by, I wanted you to be bothered by that. I wanted you to long for it because I am going to make this right. All the stuff that Satan messed up and all the chaos in the world, I'm fixing it. How? Through this new covenant. Through this messianic kingdom. Through the church. That's you and me. So if we're not up for the challenge, what is plan B? What is God's plan B in the Bible? Well, I like your answer. I don't know of one either. I do not know of one either. There is no need for a plan B because God's church is going to win. That is what it is. So it's pretty cool, but that's what we have. Any thoughts, comments, questions about this? Does this kind of make sense? There's just so much under the old covenant that was, it's daunting after a while, but the things that left you wanting was just, man, it bothered you. And then God comes along and says, no, that's why you're going to appreciate the new one. But you can't have the new without the old, right? That just logically follows. You can't have better if you didn't have something worse. You can't have an improvement if there is no baseline, nothing to start with or whatever, right? So that baseline is important. And by the way, another thing to keep in mind, how is it that when we go to heaven that all of a sudden we can't accidentally sin and fall out of heaven? How can God maintain the integrity of having free will? How can we be free will creatures and yet never sin in heaven? Logically, that doesn't make sense, right? Shouldn't you have the freedom to go against God when you're in heaven? Well, hold on. If you have this free will earth right now, you can make your free will choice and be in heaven. You can logically have that. Does that make sense? But you couldn't really have that without first having a precursor, first having a situation where you can choose to do wrong or right now. Otherwise, you'd just be forced into it. Same thing with this new covenant. You can't have a new covenant without first having an old one, and the old one was to help you realize you need this new one so much. Same thing with the idea of earth right now. Earth is really showing us that, yeah, there are a lot of good things here, but heaven is where it's at. And heaven is the place that we need, but we can't have it if we don't choose it ourselves first. There has to be some way for us to choose. So, all right, I'm opening up more cans than I care to close. Yes?
Wasn't the old covenant, a lot of that was corrupt they made their own rules that the people, they thought that the rules they made up came from God.
Yeah, you are so right. What I was trying to talk about, not doing the best job, is only the part that God laid down for his own people, and even that God himself knew that it was not fully complete without Jesus. He knew that. But then, you're right, the leaders came on and added a whole nother layer of confusion right over the top of it and just polluted it so much worse. You're right. Unfortunately, I think one of the false beliefs today is that if we could go back to the times of Jesus and we could get rid of all those Jewish traditions and those man-made rules that were surrounding the Old Testament law before Christ came, then we would have a perfect law of God. It would just be absolutely perfect and everything would be exactly the way God wanted it. And I just want to emphasize, no, because God knew without Jesus this doesn't work. Without a new covenant, the old one is just not going to do any good.
And
So,
even in the new covenant, there's certain people that change things around in their teachings that are wrong.
just
So
like
you
with
gotta
any
be-
term,
yeah.
the covenant or a will, anyone could come up to it and say, all right, I'm going to read the will. It says, Seth gets everyone's money. Well, you put it there in the will. I'm sorry. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and I'm here to tell you, that guy will back me up because he gets half of it. You know what I mean? I can do that. I can lie about the terms of the covenant, but God's given it to all of us so we can study it for ourselves, right? But I think that's no different than what a lot of people have done. They go to the Bible and said, all right, these are the words. Now let me tell you what it really means. And then they explain what they want to explain. If you're going to accept that, that's on you, because the words of the covenant are here. You know, the words of Scripture are there.
That's why they say you gotta follow the Bible
Yeah.
and what's in it. Because don't follow what's made up. And they say that, you know, the way they translate it.
Sure. And that's the other thing too. If you're not in the habit of reading this thing consistently and cross-checking it from start to finish, how are you going to know when someone's trying to pull something on you or not? You know, that's the responsibility that we all have. And by the way, you guys know this, right? I'm always counting on that to happen here, because the last thing I want is to be guilty of teaching something that is a lie, and then you guys do me the disservice of allowing me to believe that my lie is just wonderful truth and that I'm so smart, and then I go teach a bunch of other people the same lie and then perpetuate a lie. That's the last thing I want to do. So you guys are a nice filter, because you're studying God's Word too, you're looking at it, and you're helping me catch some of these mistakes that I missed, you know, and then the iron sharpens iron is happening here too. So let's finish with this passage. Let's finish with this one. Thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day, and the fixed order of the moon for stars for light by night, who stirs up the seas so that its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. If this fixed order departed from before me, declares the Lord, then the offspring of Israel will also cease from being a nation before me. Thus says the Lord, if the heavens above can be measured and the foundations of the earth searched out below, then I will also cast off all the offspring of Israel for all that they have done, declares the Lord. In other words, they can't. These things cannot happen. And so, as surely as these things can't happen, that's as surely as I'm going to never cast you off. I'm going to keep Israel as a nation. But who is Israel? Who is Israel? More specifically, he doesn't say Israel. What does he say? He says, offspring of Israel. Galatians chapter 3, right around verse 29. Or actually verse 26 all the way through 29, I believe. Galatians chapter 3. If you belong to Christ, you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. You are Abraham's offspring. That's who you are. So, this promise is for you. That's what this promise is for. Physical Israel isn't going to get it, but the real offspring is, and that's who we are. And in case anyone wants to be critical of this too, let's remind ourselves, because there are some people that disagree with this line of thinking, with the whole idea of lumping in what the New Testament says about the Old, weird as that sounds. And they want to say, you know, you need to take Scripture literally. That's the mantra that will be used. Take the Word of God literally. He says Israel, he means Israel. Literal, physical Israel is going to never cease to exist before God. Well, hold that thought. Because if you say that, you're not taking it literally either. because literal physical Israel at this time already ceased to exist before God. Remember that? 722, they were scattered. They were thrown out there, and then the term Ephraim and the term Israel, in Hosea he says, you're not my people anymore. And so they were regarding them already as people who are just used to be with God, no longer with God anymore, mixed with the Gentiles, those scattered. That's what Israel technically was often used for at that time, at this particular time period. So people who want to make this say what they try to teach today, they're not using it literally either. They're not. They're not. So don't let the literal thing fool you or whatever. What you want is the inspired, the truth of the matter. Who is the offspring of Israel? Well, don't take my word for it. Take Paul's word for it. Take God's word through Paul, Galatians chapter 3, verse 26 and following. Those who belong to Christ. So can we be defeated? Well, I would say that if the heavens can be completely measured, then yeah, we could be defeated. Is anyone up for that one? Figure out how far space goes yet? I'm still waiting to figure out how far that is, yeah. How far down, have we made it to the Earth's core yet? How far do we go down there? It's pretty dangerous, I guess, right? I'm out of my field here, but I feel pretty confident that we're never going to cease, because that's what God said. So what do you guys think? I'm seeing a lot of interesting looks today, guys. I wish I could read them better, but I can't. So please talk to me after this. Let's pray.